All right, my English teacher friends. So in this video, I want to show you one of my alternative grading methods that guarantees that the student has sustained a cogent line of reasoning. I'm going to be using poetry for this particular writing workshop, but I'll follow it up with some rhetorical analysis, synthesis, argument, persuasion, and do the whole gamut across the expository modes. But just to wet our whistles, I'm going to start us with poetry. So here's what I do for this particular piece. Students so just for context, I'm very early in my academic year at the time of posting this. So second week of school, we in upstate New York, we start after Labor Day. So my students are writing their first essays in AP Lit and in my junior Gen Ed class. And we're focusing on poetry. So to ensure that they have a cogent line of reasoning, we're using my template of the syllogistic method, but I also use these balls of yarn to show them literally, they can visually, palpably, tangibly see how their line of reason either stays intact or it goes for a bird walk, gets waylaid, or just breaks all in all. So I'll demonstrate this for you with two syllogistic body paragraphs, and then hopefully you can grade a whole bunch of papers really fast. So those that are familiar with my work know that I've invented, I think I'm over like 50 alternative grading methods at this stage of the game. I'll be writing a textbook about it shortly, and I occasionally do some webinars and host like some podcasts and stuff like that on it. So it's fascinating. So you get your weekends and your evenings back, and you get to break free from that age-old paradigm of putting oceans of red ink in the margins of students' papers, because that doesn't really help them grow and mature as writers all that much. So the first poem that we're going to take a look at is The Rose That Grew from Concrete by Tupac. This was one that we did with my Gen Ed juniors, and very simple poem, but the students love it because most of them know who Tupac is and they're not aware that he wrote such fantastic poetry. So I always like to dazzle them and kind of ignite their intellectual curiosity to read more. And I have a lot of students that end up falling in love with Jim Morrison of The Doors and Tupac for whatever the reason each year when I introduce poetry. So the first question is this: how do I tackle the body paragraphs? So for those that you're new to my templates, you're new to my YouTube channel, just go in there and you can do deep dives into my declarative and inverted thesis. Those are the templates I use to house and construct the introductory paragraph. Body paragraphs, we always proceed syllogistically. So I'm just going to give a real cursory overview of this because I'm assuming that most people have probably seen my templates at play. So I use the syllogistic method, which is rooted in the Aristotelian tradition, comes from Aristotle. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the aristocratic boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, word wrangling, wordsmithing, just basic argumentation. And they would throw out these juicy questions like, what is justice? And you have whole books written about that, such as Plato's Republic. And each time a philosopher or a student comes to the mic, the proverbial mic, they drop a syllogism, and it goes from premise, conclusion. So the example that I normally give in my workshops is this. First premise: arsenic is deadly. Second premise: my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion: my dog is going to die. We want students to have very computative, very mathematical, very sequential, chronological lines of reasoning, right, that don't break. They build upon each other, like 1 + 2 = 3. It has to be very sequential. So in terms of writing literary analysis, this is what my template looks like. The first premise is going to be an argument containing terms and devices, literary terms and devices. So we have to remember, it's expository writing. So literary analysis is. So you got to argue. So you got to argue using the terms and devices. This is always going to be a 3-sentence move. It's a tactical move. And I'll model that for you a couple of times. From there, the second premise is textual support. You teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing. You don't want to do one far more at the expense of the other. Otherwise, it falls out of kilter. And the conclusion of the paragraph, not the conclusion of the essay. So the conclusion of the syllogistic paragraph is where the housing of the textual analysis is. And you link back to the prompt, you link back to the thesis, and you kind of echo everything. So a syllogism more or less comes full circle on itself. All in all, students ask me this. We're using templates, Mr. Kuhn. Your introductory template of the declarative and inverted thesis, you're asking for 4 sentences, no more, no less. How many sentences is a syllogistic body paragraph? And I always tell them, shoot for 10 sentences, kind of hard cap it at 12. I think if you go over 12, you're probably going to bloviate, get wayward, go off on a tangent, and most likely break the line of reasoning. So students need to have choice, So if they go over 12, they have to be able to articulate it and defend why they're doing that. But we don't want these like big unwieldy paragraphs. So let me show you the yarn trick. The first premise is an argument containing terms and devices or devices. And I always tell my students to multitask the first premise. Otherwise, the essay is going to read like this: 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph syntax, 1 paragraph metaphor, right? And it's way too elementary. Students need to begin to see, even at the gen ed level, right? They need to see how the literary functions impact each other, how they hold hands, how they interact with each other. So, like, what does a rhetorical question have to do with the tone? Or what does the metaphor have to do with like a dichotomy or a juxtaposition or something of that nature? So by multitasking in these first 3 sentences, students are going to combine and connect a couple of literary terms and or devices. So it's going to be 3 sentences. I always tell my students in the first body paragraph to start where the author starts. So we're going to start where Tupac starts, and my students transition with clauses like this right from the onset. It cues the reader in to the fact that the writer is organized and that they have a chronology, they have a sequence. So look at how we drop the terms and argue. Right from the onset, Tupac's rhetorical question brings to light the odd paradox of his rags to riches story. He draws attention to the fact that he is an anomaly. Kids growing up in such settings typically do not actualize the degree of success that he has been so blessed to witness in his lifetime. The extended metaphor of the rose illustrates Tupac's sheer grit to make something wonderful of his life in spite of the insurmountable odds. All right, so I tell my kids that the first premise is a promise. So to sustain the line of reasoning, I would take a blue piece of yarn and put it next to the rhetorical question and the paradox. I'm promising you, dear reader, that I'm going to discuss a rhetorical question and the paradox that is linked to it. Second, and I'm going to indicate this by a red piece of yarn, I'm going to talk about the characterization and the setting, right? So like kids growing up in this setting typically don't experience this degree of a rags to riches story like Tupac. So that's going to come second in my second premise. And then orange, I'm going to talk about the metaphor. So do you see this? I have to go rhetorical question, paradox, setting, characterization, theme. It's kind of all melded together, and then metaphor. So I'm going to talk about those 3 things in my second premise. And ultimately, the blue will connect to the blue, the red will connect to the red, and the orange. So I have my students print out their essays and tape them around the room. And with my yarn, I go through and I basically do the connection for them. That's how I grade their papers. And if things are not connected, they know that they don't have a clear, cogent line of reasoning in their paper, and they're going to need to go back and revise it. So we can either do a writing workshop individually, or we can like whole class construct. And usually after students see this a few times, they're like, aha, and they have that eureka moment, the light bulb illumines, and they're like, I get it, I get it. So let me demonstrate for you from top to bottom how this works. So take the first premise again, it's going to be 3 sentences, and then we'll connect. Right from the onset, Tupac's rhetorical question brings to light the odd paradox of his rags to riches story. He draws attention to the fact that he is an anomaly. Kids growing up in such a setting typically do not actualize the degree of success that he's been so blessed to witness in his lifetime. The extended metaphor of the rose illustrates Tupac's sheer grit to make something wonderful of his life, despite of the insurmountable odds. So let's go back here. So in the second premise, I should immediately switch to blue. I promised the reader that I would talk about rhetorical questions and paradoxes. So the second premise begins 4th sentence, always, always, always. I should be talking about what I mentioned up top, the rhetorical question and the paradox. So I should have a quote or a paraphrase or both that are germane to that promise, to the blue string. So I should be able to connect blue to blue here, but look what happens. As one of the most prominent rappers of all time, Tupac chose to explain to the world that he learned to breathe fresh air. He overcame his impoverished upbringing. He succeeded. By writing this poem, he proves that even though no one ever cared, he surpassed the stereotype of the streets and triumphed to fame. Wait a minute. I thought we were supposed to talk about the rhetorical question and the paradox, but we seem to be talking about the red, right? Everything has a chronology. Logic is chronology and sequence, right? It's order, it's math, it's computation. You promised me to talk about the blue first, but you're talking about the red, right? So you said blue first. We should go blue, red, yellow. But in the second premise, all this stuff is kind of connected to the red. So we went out of order. So we're not keeping our line of reasoning, and we're not keeping our promise of the first premise. So the slide goes on to the next screen here. Tupac brought inspiration to the children in the ghetto, demonstrating to them that everyone has the ability to move up the social web. Such a rags to riches story just doesn't happen on its own. Tupac tells us that by keeping his dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Most kids that grow up in the urban jungle get beaten down by their environment, but Tupac learned to walk without having feet, and that he did not let his bleak surroundings dictate the course of his life. This is something very early on in the year I want to point out to kids. To me, it seems like we're no longer doing literary analysis. We're doing plot analysis. We're basically retelling the story of the poem while sprinkling in a few quotes, right? And this is why that first premise is crucial. You have to argue with your lit terms in order to perform literary analysis. So some people call this a claim. Some people call it a topic sentence. I call it a first premise because it has to have a wide scope. And I really like 3 sentences to house it. So we didn't talk about the rhetorical question. We didn't talk about the paradox. We kind of got to characterization, setting, theme, and we didn't really talk about the metaphor. So these strings are just dangling there. They're not connected to anything. We didn't keep our promise. We didn't sustain the line of reasoning. So in the end here of the conclusion, we got to go echo the thesis and echo the prompt. As illustrated by the American dream, if someone works hard enough, they will get to live out their dream. They will grow from a crack in the concrete. They will become a social anomaly. It's well written, right? So in terms of the voice, the rhythm, the flow, the quote transitions are pretty smooth. Grammar, punctuation, syntax is pretty tight. But man, oh man, disorganized. So if this were on my board, I would not be able to connect the strings, the yarn to anything. It would just be dangling there. So kids come in the next day of class, and they see if they're connected or disconnected. If it's disconnected, they got to revise, right? So in particular, like I'm just looking for a line of reasoning. This is my teaching of line of reasoning, right? All the other bit stuff we'll get to later on in the year. I don't need to teach the whole kit and caboodle on day one. So what do I do next? Like if I want to revise this, or next subsequent essay, I'm doing another poetry analysis. What do I do next? How do I make it better? Bust out another syllogism. So we're going to switch the poem and use Jorge the Church Janitor Finally Quits by Martina Spada, just to make it fresh and show you something different. Yet again, we're going to go syllogistically, 3 sentences with an argument containing the terms and or devices, teeter-totter balance, the quoting and paraphrasing, and then the links, the promise, the echo in terms of textual analysis, and the conclusion, shoot for 10 to 12 sentences. So let's do the same thing here with our yarn, all right? Right from the onset, so students, like this is very training wheel. Ultimately, we'll take down the scaffolding and the training wheels as we progress. So right from the onset, Espada creates the stark dichotomy between his Hispanic narrator and the congregation hosting the church function. So we're going to talk about dichotomy is orange, right? So we're getting into a little bit of characterization and the dichotomy, the split between the Hispanic custodian and the congregation at church. Let's see what red is going to be. Playing upon time-worn racial cliches, he euphemistically critiques the irony of the situation. So we've got a lot going on in here. We're going to talk about cliches, euphemisms, and irony is red. Even the syntactical arrangements highlight the racial tension while further accentuating the latent hypocrisy. So syntax is blue. 4th sentence begins the second premise. Since we talked about the dichotomy first, we should talk about the dichotomy first in the second premise. So it's literally a 1, 2, 3 in the 1, 2, 3 of the second premise. So let's connect the orange to the orange, and let's take it from the top again. Right from the onset, Espada creates the stark dichotomy between his Hispanic narrator and the congregation hosting the church function. Playing upon time-worn racial cliches, he euphemistically critiques the irony of the situation. Even the syntactical arrangements highlight the racial tension while further accentuating the latent hypocrisy. So we got to connect that orange, right? We're talking about dichotomy first. Look at what our quote is doing. Look at what our paraphrase is doing. Keep it connected, keep it germane. Immediately, the racial divide is brought to the forefront because no one asks where Jorge is from. He must be from the country of janitors. He's always mopped this floor. So by saying divide, it's a synonym for dichotomy. We are aligned. So we got a quote that is germane to that. So we would connect the orange to the orange. This is connected. Our line of reasoning is intact. We quote, we analyze. It is clear from the beginning that none of the church attendees have an interest in helping Jorge to feel welcome. Even polite social decencies like asking where someone is from elude their thought. Espada amplifies this tension by suggesting that Jorge must come from the country of janitors. Clearly, this is tongue-in-cheek because if one is to pull down a world map, such a place does not exist. So why are we quoting that phrase, that little thing from the poem, country of janitors? Why are we doing it here? Red to red. The second thing you mentioned in the first premise is the time-worn racial cliches, the euphemisms, and the irony. So that red gets connected second. We are on fire in terms of our line of reasoning. So let's see where this goes. The narrator is playing upon the racist sentiment that all janitors come from Mexico, clearly a gross oversimplification and generalization that is hurtful and damning. Another key feature in the opening stanza are the frequent comma splices. Why are we talking about comma splices now? Because blue is syntax. That was third. So the orange is connected to the orange. The red is connected to the red. The blue now needs to be connected. A conversation about the syntactical arrangements. So another key feature in the opening stanza are the frequent comma splices. Espada does this to add to the irony of the situation. While Jorge is perceived as being just a simple migrant janitor there to accommodate the parishioners, he gently mocks them with his poor punctuation. When we tie this syntactical twist to the fact that the Spanish music of his name is lost when the guests complain about toilet paper, the ignorance of the attendees becomes much more magnified. Not only can they not properly pronounce Jorge's name and honor him in a dignified manner, but they deliberately exclude him for being other. While the party is going on, Jorge is simply seen as an object, a mop that will push on without him once he quits, sniffing along the floor like a crazy squid with stringy gray tentacles. All right, so let me play teacher for a second. I'm like, what is this connected to? You all of a sudden you brought in personification and objectification, right? Which is one of the main features of this poem. It looks like we've exceeded 12 sentences. So if I were to revise this with a student and have a conference, I would say starting here where my arrow is to the conclusion, I would take that out and hold that off to the next body paragraph. Put personification and objectification into the next body paragraph's first premise, because you did not promise in your first premise to talk about objectification and personification. So you broke your line of reasoning. You broke your promise. So you can't bring extraneous things into this at all. So the conclusion just echoes the prompt, echoes the thesis. The actions of the churchgoers go against the fundamental principles of every world religion, yet they are blind to their ways. This is the ugly face of how racism manifests itself. It's just unfortunate that it finds itself rearing its head in what are supposed to be holy places. So if we get rid of those sentences, we're hovering around 12, and it's more of a compact, bite-size, syllogistic body paragraph. So a really cool exercise to grade drafts quickly, especially if your main focus is on teaching line of reasoning. So note that my Teach It Right 5-week mastermind is now being offered through the National Writing Project. I'm very stoked about that. It's quite a big honor for me to be working alongside the National Writing Project. I've admired their work for years. So what we do is Sunday evenings for 5 consecutive weeks, we meet from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I'm in upstate New York, so Eastern Standard Time. We meet for an hour and we go over all things templates, all things alternative grading methods, all things Nuance Academy, Word Study Academy, Plato's Plato, discussion modality. So all my kit and caboodle. And the kicker is this. If you add that up, it's 5 hours of hanging out together. But the cool thing is this. The National Writing Project will award a 10-hour badge of completion for your 5 hours, because there's a modicum of homework, maybe 10-15 minutes of prep every week, and that is it. So if you want more information on that, you can go to www.teachinghowtowrite.com, or you can go to www.nwp.org. That works as well. That's directly to the National Writing Project site. If you would like these slides, then by all means, fire me off an email at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com, or if you want to chat further about the Teach It Right 5-week mastermind. Also know that now that school's in session, I will be offering a regular cadence of webinars with Perfection Learning. So probably once a month. So stay abreast of that. And then my good buddies, Tim Freitas and Brandon Abden, and I are going to be presenting at this fall's NCTE conference in Anaheim, California. So lots of exciting stuff happening in my life, and I'm beyond blessed and grateful for that. So be well, happy teaching, happy writing.